Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. Thank you, Robbie, for talking to me again. I appreciate it. Uh, my name is Bruce Olav Solheim, and I am a history teacher at Citrus College in Glendora, California. I've been teaching here full time as a tenured professor since 1998. I'm now considered a distinguished professor, which just means I've been here too long. They give you that title after a while, as a nudge to try to get you to retire, I guess. And I've done a lot of things in my life. I have been in the U.S. Army. I was in the Army for 6 years. I was first a jail guard in Germany when it was during the Cold War, when it was West Germany. And I was a helicopter pilot at the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg. They changed their name to Fort Liberty and now back to Fort Bragg again, but it's still the 82nd Airborne no matter what. So I was there. I worked in the defense industry. I was a defense contractor working for Boeing. And then I've been an academic, boy, I've been teaching over 34 years. So published a lot of books. I was a Fulbright scholar in Norway in 2003, Fulbright professor. I have taken a turn in my writing in 2017. I started writing about the paranormal, sharing those stories. So my publishing career took a different turn there. Even published comic books and stuff because that's my first love, actually, comic books. It's how I learned how to read. Uh, and I have 4 children, 2 grandchildren, married to Ginger, doing great, past retirement age, but I'm still going because I still love teaching. I like teaching. I love teaching young people and opening up things for them so they can discover it, kind of like a guide, guiding them to discover for themselves. So that's what I do.
A lot of our episodes, we've kind of covered the psychic and the paranormal type phenomenon, UFOs. But this one, I kind of wanted to discuss more about the Vietnam War because I noticed that you wrote 2 books that kind of deal with the Vietnam War. How'd you get interested in wanting to cover that one? Because it seems like even most media, it's difficult. It's a challenge. It seems like it, whenever you watch a Vietnam War movie, it doesn't leave you with the feeling that we won, and it doesn't leave you with the feeling that we lost. You're kind of like, what just like it's like a fever dream or a haze dream, and I think it's because there's only really one way to talk about it, and it's kind of like we just did all this. We either people say we got our butts kicked, or we should have never been over there in the first place, or some people that like my great grandfather, he would always talk about like you can't talk bad about like Coca-Cola and you can't talk bad about the Vietnam War because he was over there. So like
Hmm.
there's a lot of things where it's like two
Yeah.
opposite ends. Where do you find with your book and what you wanted to discuss? Where did you want to focus and why the Vietnam War?
Well, personally, I'll start with that first and then academically. My brother fought in Vietnam. He did 2 tours of duty. He died in Christmas time 2023 from Agent Orange related disease, cancer, heart condition. He had PTSD. He was 100% disabled. So he was very much affected by the war. I have vivid memories of being on the home front, when my brother was over there. My parents watching the news every night, worrying that he wouldn't come home. And he did come home, luckily, but he was a very different person. I still remember when he came home, the night he came home, we picked him up at the airport. He just seemed different. And he was very skinny, for one thing. Physically, he was different. And he locked himself in his room while everybody was upstairs celebrating his homecoming. And I went to knock on his door, and he had his headphones on, and the music was so loud that you could hear it loud through his headphones. And he did not want to interact. I mean, he was just in this zone. I think it was very hard for him. I didn't understand it at the time. I was a little disappointed because I had like my new baseball cards, and I said, "Hey, I want to show them to my brother, and get back to where we were before he left." And we never got there until the end of his life. At the end of his life, while he was in the hospital dying, I was able to reconnect to my brother. It was, at the very end there, but uh, it was amazing. We were reminiscing about before he went to Vietnam, and I helped his wife get all his VA benefits, and so they didn't have to have all their resources drained during his illness. So, but I even told my brother I loved him, and he told me he loved me. We hadn't done that since we probably didn't even do that when we were little. I mean, it was amazing. But then he passed away, and mercifully. So that whole thing is kind of reminiscent of what our country has gone through. We didn't want to talk about it. When we did talk about it, it was just an argument. It was a terrible, divisiveness, hawks versus doves. Let's remember, let's not remember, let's never go to war again. Let's make sure we win next time. Divided in how to assess it. And it reminds me of a friend of mine who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's a Vietnamese refugee. He said that his famous quote, which I love, is that all wars are fought twice, once on the battlefield and once in memory. I'll just leave you with that. It's pretty powerful.
I guess for my generation, we're a little bit disconnected in the history books necessarily. You can't teach Vietnam in such a short thing. I mean, they don't really even teach the Kennedy stuff because it leads into Vietnam and they have to go into spend a whole amount of time that they are allotted to with Vietnam alone. But from people that I know, like my dad, whose dad served or something of that sort, or was in Vietnam, they hate President Johnson. They hate everything about that they didn't want to be over there. They think the Vietnam War was awful. My grandfather wouldn't say anything about Vietnam. Wouldn't really like you get a couple things out of him, but he wouldn't talk about his experience. You could tell there was something that happened there. And then for me, I'm kind of looking at it through a historical lens where if you look at documentaries, if you look at things, you will find the nasty, horrible stuff that happened over there. But there's not really blamed placed at a whole lot of people's feet. Now, the general public that was alive at the time blames Johnson for the troop involvement, the increase. I think we see that when he took over from JFK. But I want to get your kind of thoughts on where you decided to look for information. I mean, if you were experiencing it at the time, but so much stuff didn't come out until later. Like if you got Watergate, but even now we're finding things on the internet now. Like I'm finding old phone calls where LBJ is like, "What fucking mess did I get myself into with
Right.
Vietnam?" But he's like, "I'm not going to say that to the public. You got to put on a face." It's like, hey, that was released in 1999, just shoved in the LBJ library. Did anybody hear that at the time?
Yeah. It's as Walter Lefebvre, he's a Vietnam historian, American historian of Vietnam War. He said that Vietnam is like a long, twisted nightmare for America. And, we woke up from it. We didn't want to recall it, but we have to as historians, as citizens who want to learn lessons. And to be fair to LBJ, which is kind of what the focus is, I think, sorry, today, he inherited that. I mean, you can go all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, which nobody really does to understand what happened. Woodrow Wilson, right after World War I, Ho Chi Minh approached the negotiators in Paris at Versailles after World War I, looking for independence for Vietnam from France. He was totally ignored. I've seen the diplomatic cables, and they said they dismissed him as being awkward looking and very racist terms. It's like we're not even going to talk to this guy. So he was not even on their radar. Well, he became the most well-known figure, controversial in the Vietnamese community, but still, he was a well-known nationalist first and then a communist. He adopted communism later on, actually, after that, and became the first member of the Communist Party in Indochina and fought on our side in World War II. He was helping us against the Japanese. And then everything turned after a fateful decision made by Truman to support the French, and then Eisenhower continued to support the French in their war against the Vietnamese communists, Ho Chi Minh. And when France called it quits in 1954 after 8 years of fighting against the Vietnamese communists, we stepped in and started to support the South Vietnamese regime, which the French had built kind of artificially. They're the same people, North and South Vietnam, but they had been divided by that war. And we had already been paying for the French war effort, like 80% of it from about 1950 to 1954 anyway. So, we had already bankrolled the French. We made a fateful decision because of the Cold War, because of communism. We were blinded by anti-communism and said Ho Chi Minh's a bad man because he's communist, not realizing, well, he might be the best hope for unification for the country, and maybe we can coax him away from communism, if we support him. But when we made the decision to support France, we kind of inherited that whole French regime and approach to the war, which we tried the same things the French did. And it didn't work for France. It didn't work for us. So, and you brought something up earlier about, about losing the war. I avoid saying that we lost the war, and not for politically correct reasons, but just to be precise. We failed to achieve our objectives. If you look at military battles, we won every major battle. And as Ho Chi Minh said, or no, it was Vo Nguyen Giap, the lead North Vietnamese general, brilliant general. He said, that may be true that you won every battle, but you lost the war. And what he meant by that, of course, is that we left. The mission was not accomplished. We realized the mission was undoable given the constraints that we had. The servicemen and women who were there fought brilliantly. They won, like I said, every major battle, but we lost our political will and we lost support at home, just like the French. The French also lost support at home. There were protests against their war effort. We didn't pay attention to any of that stuff, and we just repeated it and got the same result as the French. And I probably went on too far there.
No, you're
Sorry, I
perfect.
was
So this isn't
summarizing the whole thing.
necessarily about communism. Like, there's always that fear with Hoover and all these others talking about communism is going to take over, and it just gets broad brushed or painted everywhere. But it's really nationalism that they're kind of misconstruing. They're looking at Vietnam nationalism, and really they're calling it communism. It's not communism. It's a different way of. They're just
It's
afraid that they're going to be influenced because it's different than American, I guess,
yeah,
ideology.
we missed an opportunity, like I said, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson. If we would have helped the Vietnamese to get their independence, which seems to be what we should be about, he wasn't even a communist yet. Yeah, that came later, because the Russians hadn't turned toward communism totally yet. They were still fighting a civil war over who was going to control, Russia. And so we missed an opportunity there. We missed an opportunity when we supported the French in their war from 46 to 54. And then we missed an opportunity when Diem, the South Vietnamese president, was killed on around November 1st, 63. And then, of course, 3 weeks later, Kennedy was killed. So, not surprisingly, I always tell my students it's not a coincidence that the two major obstacles to an American war, full out war in Vietnam, President Diem of South Vietnam and President Kennedy of the US, were both killed within 3 weeks. And a year later, we were in a full scale war in Vietnam.
What are
So
your
it's not a coincidence.
What are your thoughts on Kennedy's actions towards Vietnam? Obviously, there's a lingering question. I think I mentioned off air. Do you think he would have pulled out or not? Now, I've heard from like John McCone, who was a CIA director at the time, and he apparently was a close aide with the administration of JFK, Eisenhower, Nixon, and LBJ. But he talked about that Kennedy was going to reduce the number of troop involvement in Vietnam to the number that was set at Eisenhower's administration, not fully pull out. But a lot of people want to believe that he was going to fully pull out. Now, I think it's NSAM 63, that agreement to pull out, but Robert McNamara brought it up, and it was supposed to be, it wasn't signed, though, is the thing. I've looked everywhere. It's not signed by Kennedy. It's kind of taken at his word that this is what he was going to do. He was going to pull out fully. So I'm curious what your thoughts on it. Like I said, I'm a Kennedy fan. The most I've seen documented and historical wise happens to do with LBJ when it came to just the number he increased. But I'm always curious because Kennedy's kind of brief time in office, he had these things that were in motion that really never got fully succeeded.
Right. No, well, his whole foreign policy style was something called the flexible response. And he very much was an anti-communist, but he was also a realist in a sense. He's a World War II guy. I mean, he's a hero of, PT 109 and the South Pacific, that whole story. So he was a brilliant guy. He's the only president I have a portrait of in my office or in my home is President Kennedy. I salute his portrait every morning just to let you know what a kind of a fanatic I am about Kennedy. So I agree with you. But yes, I did a lot of research under Gary Hess, who was my main doctoral professor, and his specialty was the Vietnam War. And I did a whole summer of research in the National Archives and all the records about the diplomatic records about answering that question. Would Kennedy have done what Johnson did? And it's still a mixed story, like you said. Now, my personal belief, the evidence seems to be more towards he would never want a major land war in Vietnam. But did he want to have a flexible response? In other words, Green Berets, special forces, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's his style. Kennedy was flashy. He was super cool. He was hip, if you want to use that term. That's what he wanted to do. He didn't want some big traditional war in Vietnam. So there were a lot of people who resisted him, high level people, and of course defense contractors who, they stood to lose out if we didn't have a major war in Vietnam. And so my feeling is that, and based on the research I did too for Dr. Hess for his book, um, is that he would not have gone full blown. He would have adjusted the troop. I think it was about 18,000, 19,000, uh, uh, trainers, troops that not troops, regular troops, but like
Advisors. Yeah.
advisors that we had in Vietnam. We would have kept that for a while and kind of adjusted, flexible response. That you always come back to his style of foreign policy, and that's what would have happened. Now he might have ultimately he said some things that kind of signaled it. He said ultimately talking about the South Vietnamese, it's their war. They have to win it or lose it. We can help them, but they have to win it or lose it. And the more we increased our help to South Vietnam, the less independent they became, the more dependent they became. And just to give you a practical illustration that my brother observed when he was in Vietnam, he was a mobile radio operator out in the field. So he called in airstrikes and all that. He said that the South Vietnamese heavily relied on U.S. air power. I mean, he said that if without the U.S. air power, they would have collapsed long before. And that includes the use of helicopters and everything else. And he said sometimes some of the South Vietnamese generals would call in airstrikes just for like a fireworks show. They were manipulating us, some of them were. But he said, like the ground troops, those people were great, the ones that he worked with. He called them the Black Rangers, and they're like special forces, South Vietnamese. He said they were great troops. They get blamed a lot, for losing the war. They didn't lose the war. The way we set it up, we made them more and more dependent on us and less independent. And it was exact opposite of what we should have been trying to do. If we want them to be resistant to communism, we got to increase their independence, not be totally dependent on us because we couldn't stay there forever. And so anyway, I think that's what would have happened. It wouldn't have been what happened under Johnson. That being said, I don't totally blame Johnson either. Like I said, there's a lot of decisions that were made before that, and no president wanted to go down in history as the first one to quote unquote lose a war. So it was, and even Nixon figured, old Tricky Dick figured out a way to get out of Vietnam, as Henry Kissinger said, after a decent interval. And what did he mean by that? He meant we would take all our troops out and we would slowly stop supporting the South Vietnamese. They would eventually collapse. About a year and a half later, April 30th, 1975, and then we could say, "Hey, we weren't there anymore, though. We didn't lose. The South Vietnamese lost." But that is very disingenuous. I mean, that is horrible. It's really despicable, actually, to blame the South Vietnamese. Um, yeah, there's blame to go around, but he figured out an exit strategy that was rather tricky, thereby the name Tricky Dick. Uh, so, and Johnson knew that he wasn't going to win the war. That's why he didn't run for re-election. He made that decision in March of 68. Uh, RFK would have won. He would have beat out anybody else for the Democratic nomination. And then he was killed in June right here in LA, in Los Angeles, in the Ambassador Hotel after his victory, and in California. And his plan, he had turned anti-war, so he was going to go. He was going to take the troops out. RFK was going to take the troops out, I believe, in the spirit of his brother, and realized that it was a losing proposition. LBJ knew it was a losing proposition. You've listened to the audio tapes. Um, he wanted to win. He tried, and then he just threw his hands up and said, I can't do this. And he decided not to run again. And there's a lot of famous LBJ quotes. He's got great quotes, but one of them was the Vietnam War is the Vietnam, I can't remember exactly, something about the Vietnam War is like the bitch that killed the only woman I ever loved. And that's he wanted to be the president who brought us out of poverty, the war on poverty. That's really what he wanted to do. Wanted to be his legacy, the
Well,
war
he
on
wanted
poverty,
the Great Society, is what he
the
called it.
great society. Yeah, yeah, they said that was who he really loved. But the Vietnam War was, as he called it, a bitch, uh, that killed the only woman he ever loved, and the Great Society. So I feel kind of bad for LBJ in a way. A friend of mine, a colleague, actually wrote a book called "In His Steps," and that was by Paul Hengler. He was one of my fellow doctoral students at Bowling Green, and it was about the Kennedy legacy that was a shadow over LBJ. And of course, the Kennedy legacy was a shadow over Nixon too. Kennedy cast a long shadow for subsequent presidents. I think it was Nixon who used to. One time there was a report that he was in tears in front of a portrait of Kennedy in the White House, and said, "Why do they love you and not me?" You know, and he was. I mean, it's a long, twisted, fragmented nightmare, like that one historian said. I mean, it's just horrible how that inherited bad set of decisions carried on from president to president. And of course, it affected Ford too. Ford, becoming president, nobody elected him. Nixon resigned because of Watergate. He would have been impeached and forcibly removed from office had he not. Um, he was never impeached. A lot of people think he was impeached, but he wasn't. He resigned,
Yeah,
but
and
he would
then
have been.
didn't Ford give him a presidential pardon as well too?
Yeah,
And then
almost immediately.
Nixon pardoned Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah, so I mean, the Ford pardon of Nixon meant he wasn't going to win on his own in an election. That's why Jimmy Carter won, the main reason. And the end of the Vietnam War, people wanted somebody who had nothing to do with Washington politics, which Carter didn't. And that was part of Carter's difficulties, was that he couldn't get the bureaucracy to move. He had some great ideas. Carter, I know we're getting out of the thing there, but anyway, Vietnam casts a long shadow forward to
Oh, of
this
course,
day.
yeah. And it even goes a
Yeah.
little bit before too, as well too, when you talk about Eisenhower's administration. Um, if we examine, I'm going to ask you this, and then I kind of want to go a little bit deeper into the whole Vietnam, what kind of caused us to return, what caused that withdrawal. Because I don't think it would have happened if there wasn't such a stir up on the home front. The counterculture movement in particular, a lot of people protests, just anti-war movements that really sparked up when everyone thinks of like peace, love, protest, all these types of things. I don't think that would have happened if we would have just been like for a while, people didn't care so much about like the Vietnam War at all. It was kind of like for a little while, everyone was kind of like just going about their business. And then it's when it started coming to the home front, people started realizing, I think even the famous photograph of the napalm girl, the little Chinese girl or Vietnam girl who's on fire, skin's completely burned, and she's running through because they just napalm something and she had ran through the napalm or been in the napalm strike. And that photo brought home like Vietnam photography for media putting up in newspapers and stuff, and people started seeing what was going on there. It changed their perspectives. I mean, there's moments that are captured in time. But what is your idea of the presidential position based on some of the things you've already kind of mentioned? I mean, I'm with you on the LBJ thing. A lot of Kennedy people will not be because they all think LBJ was either behind it or he's an evil, whatever. Look, I don't think he was a good guy. I'm just saying if you examine the way he did politics is how what should have happened with politics is to get anything across. Because it seems like LBJ was one of the most effective in getting his way whenever he wanted to get his way. Now that can be a bad thing, but
He was a
Kennedy,
deal maker. Yeah, he was a deal maker, a consummate deal maker, which in Washington, that means you got to get your hands dirty. So his hands were dirty, you
like,
know.
would we even have civil rights stuff passed if it wasn't for LBJ just doing it? And now, look, he called a lot of people and he told them that we got to do this in Kennedy's honor. And I believe he was using that just to get these people on his side. Larry O'Brien, others that were a part of the Kennedy administration that he wanted on his side because Larry O'Brien wrote some great speeches. Bill Moyers wrote great speeches. Those phone calls are all available on like the 29th of November, a couple of days after Kennedy. He was using Kennedy's death to get people onto his side. But there's a conversation with George Reedy, and he says it in an interview. He says when LBJ took over, it was the LBJ administration and the Kennedy administration. Everyone was looking at LBJ what to do, and LBJ was looking at the Kennedy administration on what to do. And based on that, LBJ just assumed that Kennedy would have increased troop involvement, and the Kennedy administration just followed what LBJ wanted to do. LBJ should have stood there and made a choice himself rather than relying on what the course of action was going because he never talked to Kennedy privately about some of these things. So he doesn't know if Kennedy makes an action to put more troops in, he's just going to continue it to get more people onto his side. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the whole presidential position based on like Nixon, LBJ, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Truman, all the guys that are kind of involved in this Vietnam era situation.
Well, one guy that's never talked about is a guy named George Ball. And George Ball was in the LBJ administration. He was a deputy defense guy in the defense department, and the deputy secretary of defense or assistant secretary of defense, whatever that it was, some assistant level, right? He was always against our involvement in Vietnam, and LBJ really liked him. He liked him to be in the room because he was oftentimes was the only one that was against what we were doing. And he had that famous quote, George Ball did, that once on the tiger's back, you can't pick the place to dismount. You're going to be thrown off. And so he said it was a big mistake. And even how we got in, the way that we got into the Vietnam War officially, because you always have to have, if you don't have a declaration of war, you have to have a resolution of Congress, which was that's what authorized the Vietnam War. And that happened after the Tonkin Gulf incident. And we know, I'd done the research on it, that the Tonkin Gulf incident, which prompted the passage of the resolution in August of 64, was based on an incident that didn't really happen. It was an attack by a North Vietnamese patrol boat. There were two attacks. The first attack, everybody knows that it happened. Nobody was killed, nobody was hurt. The second attack was reported, and after that reported attack in August of 64, LBJ pushed through a joint session of Congress a resolution giving him a blank check in Vietnam, which is the authorization. You need authorization for sustained military action, and that's what he got. There were only two dissenting votes, a guy from Alaska and a guy from Oregon, I think, who both of them said just because you're in the minority doesn't mean you're wrong, which is a very important statement in a democracy. Sometimes you get proven, that later, that you were right. But Johnson pushed it through, got his authorization, started the air war. The air war then led to the ground war because we couldn't sustain our air war from bases in South Vietnam without more U.S. troops protecting those bases because the South Vietnamese troops were spread too thin and they weren't protecting our air bases and our planes were getting blown up. So that was the excuse to bring the troops in, the Marines first, March of 65. And then the Marines had a mission of protecting the air bases. That only lasted for about 2 months before they got tired of being mortared and rocketed every day. And they said, we're going to go out and find the bad guys and kill them. That was the strategy. The ground war strategy was go out, find the bad guys, and kill them. The strategy was not to hold ground or take over territory because that's the way every other war is fought. You moved towards the enemy capital, capturing ground, killing the enemy, capturing them, whatever. But in Vietnam, we only held about 5% of the territory in South Vietnam at any point. 95% was nobody controlled or the communists controlled it. We had our bases. We went out, killed the bad guys, came back. If you've seen the movie Hamburger Hill, it illustrates that point. We go out, fight, kill them, they disperse. We go back, they rebuild, come back. Then we got to go and do it again. That's why they called it Hamburger Hill. It was fought over again and again, or the A Shau Valley, that area of northern South Vietnam. But yeah, so George Ball, very important part of this to look into if your listeners are interested in getting a little bit deeper. He's the embedded dove in the Johnson administration. Johnson was very sympathetic to George Ball, but he was compelled by others like Dean Rusk and some of the old wise men, as he called them, Dean Acheson and all these other old Cold Warriors that were saying, they only saw it through the Cold War lens. And they said, we have to win. We have to, they were thinking World War II kind of stuff, and this was a different war. And they didn't really realize it. And Johnson was divided. He had his eye on his war on poverty and he had his eye on the war in Vietnam. And it was divided. And of course, expenditures too. Um, Eisenhower was, I think, a little more savvy, although I think he was heavily influenced by John Foster Dulles. His number one guy in foreign policy, and he was very much I think they were the ones who came up with and later it was, Johnson used it, even Kennedy used it. I think the domino theory, which is really just the propaganda ploy. It's like the whole idea of the domino theory,
If
I'm sure
one thing
is,
falls, they all fall.
yeah. So it starts with South Vietnam. I mean, who cares about South Vietnam? I mean, big picture, what do we need South Vietnam for, right? But if that domino falls, it sets off a row of dominoes, the last domino being the United States. So we got to stop it there. We got to kill them there, stop them there so we don't have to stop them here. And that's how they sold it to the public. And the turning point, like you said, all these horrific images came out, especially after the Tet Offensive, January, February of 68. That's when My Lai happened, the My Lai massacre, although the news of it didn't get out until a year later, March of 69. Um, but people saw on television, I saw on television, uh, how it didn't look like we were winning the war. Even Cronkite said it doesn't look like we're winning this thing. It looks like a stalemate, is what Cronkite said. Not surprisingly, 2 months later, as public opinion shifted against the war in Vietnam, Johnson decided not to run. So you're right about the horrific images and the news reporting. The news reporting changed over time. At first, it was like it always is in American wars, like rah, rah, let's go team, let's win. And then it gets kind of neutral. And then towards the end of a war, usually it gets very negative. It's like it's just about death and killing, and people get tired of it. Yeah, they knew that in World War II. That's why, as much as I like Franklin Roosevelt, they censored the news. They wouldn't show all the dead Marines in Iwo Jima on the beach. They censored all that because they didn't want people to lose heart at home. Even though they knew there were Americans being killed, they didn't want to see all these graphic pictures of it. And we saw it not only in newspapers, but we saw it live on television or on video, and that made it even worse. So
When did that start? When did the press? Because I'm listening to earlier 63, 64 phone calls of LBJ right now and kind of putting it into clip format for people to be able to get a good, because they're good, like couple minute conversations, sometimes 10, 15 minutes. But Johnson's so concerned about the press where he's like, they're writing these and they're talking about it like this. And he's telling other candidates like Yarborough and Connolly's trying to run and Yarborough's going to run against them. And there's a bunch of stuff going on where he's just like, I need no one to talk about Vietnam until after this thing is over with. Like, don't mention anything. He told Humphreys not to mention anything about Vietnam. He told him there's a lot of conversation where Johnson seemed like he was more focused on what the press was going to get from the Vietnam talk and discussion that he didn't want escaping. He was calling people that were a part of the Washington Times or something. He was calling all these people that were in charge of establishment networks. One of his main focal points or people that were on his side was Abe Fortas, who eventually was on the Supreme Court. But that guy was covering everything for Johnson. He was going into certain things about Manchester's book that came out about Johnson and the Kennedy assassination. He was talking about things about Vietnam, telling people that they needed to keep quiet on certain aspects of things or you're going to put the country and the president's life at stake. And it's just like, I understand, like what I mentioned to you earlier, I agree with the fact that I don't think LBJ is this devil that everyone wants to paint him out to be. It will get you in trouble with like Kennedy fans. But if you learn how like Johnson worked in the political thing and the way that he coaxed people and the way that he got things done, in a sense, he wasn't just not worried about his own ass. He was more focused on like the whole communistic view, which is that I'm the president, I'm going to get this done. There's not going to be an and, if, or but about it. And that's the thing is like with lives being lost and stuff like that, that didn't mean anything because the greater scheme of it was that if America looks bad by retreating or doing something of that sort, that's going to hurt the country worse and it's going to make our enemies target us more. So I'm always curious, when did the press really get a hold of this? This wasn't just the factor of Watergate, was it, with the Pentagon Papers coming out?
well, in a democracy, you're always worried about public opinion. In a dictatorship, you're not, because you can totally suppress it, but for the most part. But yes, they're always so. Any president, even if they're riding high, is worried about the media coverage. But in general, the media coverage was mostly favorable. Not to say there wasn't negative stuff here and there, until after the Tet Offensive, when it became more critical approaching 1968 as the body count increased. The Americans coming home in caskets, um, and it was after 68 that the media coverage became more critical. And you really use Walter Cronkite as a guidepost there. I mean, he is the guidepost because when as Johnson said, when you lose Walter Cronkite, we can't. I think he said it that dramatically. If we've lost Walter Cronkite, we can't win the war, or something to that effect. I don't know if it's on the tapes, but that was his sentiment. You can't lose Cronkite because Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. It was a very different news culture than it is today. He was very much trusted by everybody, Republicans, Democrats. They didn't have this. We didn't have that kind of media that was left and right. That's more reminiscent of the 1800s in America when you had Democratic newspapers, Republican newspapers, and now we have Democratic news, Republican news. But up to that
It
point, the
was when
American
Firing
media,
Line came out and they had all the people debating each other and stuff like that.
yeah, it became a left-right thing, which is an artificial division, in many ways. But
One of the
that goes
best
down
quotes
a
ever is William F. Buckley, where he's talking to, I forgot who he's talking to, but he goes, "Man, I'll suck you and you'll stay plastic." I'm like, that's an old time thing we need to bring back. That is the funniest line I've ever heard anybody drop.
He is, yeah, he was entertaining in many. He was very theatrical and very funny, odd mannerisms. But man, the guy was smart, and he did. they had some great discussions. Anyway, I like to watch old.
It's even like with Nixon, he gets called a dweeb and a loser and all this, and I don't think he was like the coolest guy in the world. But if you ever hear him talk, it's kind of like I don't disagree with the guy like at all. I think for a lot of that history kind of tacked on the record afterwards that Nixon was this stooge, idiot, dumb person. He never deleted his tapes or burned his tapes or anything like that. I was like, I think he just thought those tapes would absolve him of whatever. Because if you listen to some of it, he doesn't sound like he's playing exactly military ball, like the same mindset as all these elite people going to Bohemian Grove or doing whatever. He was more like, I'm not going to let all the secrets of the CIA out because that would damage the government as a whole more than it would about. And it wasn't for me. I was like, oh, he's a Boy Scout. He's not anything like dumb or idiotic. I think that was put on him after the fact. But I've heard him talk about like drugs on American soil and the war against drugs. I definitely think he inflated it a lot, but I also think it was a weird situation, maybe wrong information of Hoover. He started losing control at this point. Hoover was getting close to passing on, and it was getting to a point where, like, okay, your whole job as the FBI was supposed to be to take care of the home front. We have now anti-war protesters everywhere. We have all these different counterculture movements going on. You didn't do your job right. And it was because he was so focused that he thought what he had built was so stable, and it wasn't. It caused more diversity and it caused more aversion to his acts.
Right. Well, Nixon's a complicated character. I did a big study of Nixon in a graduate class we took on presidential administrations, and we had I think his name is James Barber. He had this way of classifying the presidents, and he was one of the more negative presidents, and a lot of it comes from his upbringing. A lot of people don't know he was a Quaker, which how can he be associated with the Vietnam War? He was a Quaker, but his mom was a very strict Quaker. His dad was very rough on him. Nixon always felt inadequate because his older brother, who was supposed to be the star of the family, died, and Nixon always felt horrible about it. So he was always trying to seek affection and love, and he never quite got it in politics or anything else. His famous checkers speech, after, when he was a young politician, all that stuff. He was accused of taking bribes or whatever. That's what it was about. But anyway, so he fell into what all these presidents really fell into. Well, I'll mention this. I corresponded with Oliver Stone because I really like the movie JFK, and I wrote to him. And then I saw the movie Nixon. I like that movie too. A lot of people haven't seen Nixon, but there's a particular scene in the movie Nixon where, and this is true, what happened. Nixon left the White House in the middle of the night, got his limo, and a driver, and unbeknownst to his handlers, because all presidents have handlers, right? And he went to the Lincoln Memorial, and he met with protesters who were there, young protesters. They depicted in the movie Nixon. It's one of the most, if you look it up on YouTube or whatever, it's a very powerful moment. And he's trying to explain himself in his Nixon way. He's like, well, you have to understand how this works, and then he's trying to explain the involvement and how sympathetic he is to them wanting peace. And this one girl is just sitting there looking at him, not talking. And then finally she says, "You can't stop it, can you?" And then he goes, "Oh, well, I can't, it's a president, whatever." And then the people come and grab him and take him away before he can really answer the question. And I think that speaks to what Oliver Stone calls the beast. The beast is what drives war, and it's beyond presidential politics or everyday, what goes on. It's something in human nature. You have to feed the beast. And Nixon was trying to have it both ways. And, you're going to get consumed by it. So that girl was not wrong. In a way, he couldn't stop it. Now he tried, he withdrew the troops, but it didn't end the concept of war. We've been at war ever since, really, with a very brief respite and just before the first Gulf War. But so I'm sympathetic to Nixon as well. I mean, Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of people don't know that. I mean, he was the first environmental president, other than Theodore Roosevelt, I guess, starting the National Park Service. But so yeah, Nixon's a complicated character, and in many ways sympathetic. Couldn't he? And the whole idea of how his downfall, it's kind of very Shakespearean, his downfall was because of his anger over the Pentagon Papers, which you mentioned earlier when they were released. He started the plumbers that CIA guys, former CIA guys, breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters in 72 because he was trying to plug leaks. That's why they called him the plumbers in his administration. And he was very mad at the New York Times for publishing the Pentagon Papers. None of the Pentagon Papers had anything to do with his administration. They were all the Johnson administration, but he said he was tired of, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the State Department employee who leaked that information to the press. That's why he sent them after, they broke into his psychiatrist's office, Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, to try to, make him out to be a nut case, and disparage him because he was kind of a hero in the counterculture, Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon paper release. But then they were afraid of what the Democrats had cooked up. So that's why they broke into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex and got caught. Three of the burglars, Watergate burglars, had White House credentials on them. I mean, it was a huge risk.
Well,
He
they
was
had
so
bills that were all of them had bills, and the bills were literally like if they were printed right after each other. Like that, everyone has a barcode on the bill. Each bill has a barcode. They were literally almost the exact same. They were one digit off, which means they were printed right after each other. I mean, for me, I think that's a setup. I thought they were intended to fail on purpose. Someone had did it so that can get Nixon caught. And again, I know the theories that Larry O'Brien's office was broken into, but the fact they put tape on the door, a janitor found it, removed the tape, went down the hallway, then they put the tape right back on the door. These are CIA guys. I hope our CIA is not doing that.
I don't, I don't know for a fact about that. I mean, I've heard conjecture too that Nixon thought the Democrats had some information tying him to the Kennedy assassination, and that was part of the reason they went in there. I don't know. Other than that being said out in the open, I've never seen any evidence of that, but it is kind of an
History
interesting
doesn't
thing.
even have an answer for it. If you look it up, there's like four different main theories it goes by. I honestly think he was looking for information on himself, like any bad blackmail information. But the team,
And
I just don't. Yeah.
the bottom line is he didn't need to do any of that. He was going to win. He was going to beat McGovern easily. There was no way that McGovern was going to win in 72. He didn't need to take any of these risks. He was driven by this idea of he got very paranoid, that they had something on him. And all politicians have something on them, whether it's President Trump, President, Biden or Obama, any of them. I mean, I talked about it before. They all got their hands dirty. They don't get to where they are without getting their hands dirty. And sometimes that includes people getting killed, criminal activity. I mean, it's the ultimate power. There's nobody more powerful than the president of the United States, and they are willing to do almost anything. And if not them personally, the people surrounding them who are often very Machiavellian. I mean, the most powerful advisors are the Machiavellians. And they won't tell the president, there's plausible deniability that, maybe Nixon said, I want to make sure you plug those leaks. I want to make sure we get whatever information the Democrats have. All right, let's go, boys. Let's go break into the Democratic National Headquarters. Maybe he never directly said that. I don't know. But it doesn't matter because he has the Machiavellian guys around him who will do anything. They're willing to do anything. So that's
I don't think it
I
was
I
for the Kennedy assassination with Nixon, but I will.
I don't I've never seen evidence of it, so I don't think so.
I definitely think it's the paranoia factor, but like you said with the Machiavellian thing, you hear it with LBJ in '65. He's talking to Nicholas Katzenbach, and he's literally like, "This damn rules committee is coming after me because they got the Bobby Baker stuff that's now reemerging. The press is now reporting on it. Apparently, he was giving money to people in Hong Kong or shirts or something like that, and they were considering it like a political, you know." contortion type thing. And he's literally talking to us like, get Hoover on it. Hoover will back me up. And he goes, all the Senate's just going to go after me. They don't even care about what the facts are. Let me show you what the facts are. Maybe he was innocent. I don't know. They're talking about funds that he's embezzling and stuff. We know about the Billy Celeste stuff. That's come out about certain things with LBJ funding certain things and getting money off the back end. But again, there's this paranoia factor that starts happening, and you see the downfall of LBJ, not just because of the Vietnam War taking up a lot of his time, but it's this paranoia, something else bigger than me is out there, a bigger fish. For Nixon, I always considered him like, we always just talk about Nixon when Watergate happens. What about all the other stuff we learned about the CIA, the FBI that came after the Church Committee? I'm like, oh, because Nixon's the monster. If there's just one monster, there's one boogeyman. We got the boogeyman. What about the other boogeymen? There's more. There's always a bigger one. And that's what I kind of wanted to ask you about. Did this alert you more to, I'm not going to say the now term for it, but I'm going to use the old term for it, establishment. Did this now solidify more in your head that there was a bigger thing than the presidential position when it came to the words of the establishment? Like you mentioned, the beast, the war machine.
I think that the war machine, the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us about, the deep state, as they say now, it's all true. I mean, it is all true. Whatever you call it, it's not just a, like a conservative, Trump supporter kind of thing. I mean, this has been going on since after World War II. And Eisenhower was right on target when he talked about the military industrial complex. And you notice in the movie JFK, that's where they start. That's where Oliver Stone starts. The whole movie is with, some pleasant things about Kennedy. And then all of a sudden, the Eisenhower speech, right? And then the Bay of Pigs. And then, the Cubans and all that stuff. And so, Eisenhower's warning, I always, I've heard people say, oh, well, he was senile. He was old, he was sick, he was senile when he was on his way out. That's not what he meant, and I'm thinking, I've seen the speech 100 times, the military industrial complex speech, and everybody should watch it. That man is not senile. He was the supreme Allied commander in World War II, a brilliant strategist and tactician, could get incredibly difficult people to work together, like Montgomery and Patton, for one, one case. He knew what he was talking about. He didn't have anything to lose. He wasn't going to be president anymore. He's already been a 5-star general. He's going to tell us what we need to know, like a grandfather, like, trying to give you some advice. And he was perfectly lucid. And who better to know the defense industry than Ike, than Eisenhower. And he wasn't some left-wing intellectual from an Ivy League school. He was a conservative, pro-business Republican president. So when he says this, I think we need to pay attention to it. When something is said that's kind of out of character a little bit, what the media or the government or propaganda would want us to believe, you have to take notice of it. It's like, wait a second, this guy's saying that. We better listen to what he's saying and what it means. And I have to explain it to my students because they're not quite sure what it means. So how I phrase it with them, the way I have them frame it is say, if it indeed is true, what Eisenhower said, that this military industrial complex, if we're not careful, is going to take over our government, what evidence would there be? And they draw a blank for a couple of minutes. And then finally, I'll have one student raise their hand, usually in the back of the class, somebody who hasn't really thought of said anything yet. It's usually one of those guys. And they'll raise their hand that we would always be at war. And I said, exactly. It feeds the beast. It feeds the war industry. We never stand down if we go from one war to the next, and that is the military industrial complex. And I'm not anti-military at all. I mean, I was in the military. My son's still in the Air Force. He's been in for 25 years. I think we need a strong defense, but it's what General Smedley said after World War I, the famous World War I general, American general. He said that war is a racket. He said it right out. War is a racket. And we have to be careful, and we have to manage it effectively. And or as Eisenhower said, we in the councils of government must guard against unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military industrial complex. Those are wise words right there. And Eisenhower is also an underrated president. He's very underrated, I think.
I'm not a fan of Eisenhower just for obviously the Kennedy stuff. There was a couple things I wasn't too happy about, but I think it's like that with every president. I think there's another perspective you learn, like with LBJ. There's other stuff you learn with Kennedy. I mean, with LBJ, he signed military contracts, and a lot of these people were friends of his that were getting major kickbacks from the military industrial complex idea, or the bills that were passed. I think it was Harold Byrd, who owned the Texas School Book Depository, was a friend of LBJ. He made so much money after the Kennedy assassination stuff. When the war escalated, they started signing contracts with the military, and he got a bunch. There's a couple phone calls where he mentions Byrd's name, but one that's really interesting is Truman made a statement, and it's always at the ending of their whatever their not their life, but their time in office or somewhere in a position of power. And it was when Dag Hammarskjöld was killed, the ambassador. He was flying to the Indonesia to make a peace agreement to get these Papua Guinean people their independence, and his plane went down. And he was found away from his plane, clutching a thing of grass with a bullet hole in him. And so the crash, they couldn't retrieve the altimeters to see if they were messed up. I think they've done 9 Senate investigations now, and they've brought up that it might be likely that he might have been killed by someone like Hoover or Allen Dulles because their reputations have diminished over time. Now, I've spoke to that Senate person and had him on the show. That's just the factual thing of where they stand on this. Whether it was resistance fighters that got to him, he was killed in a non-plane threatening way. The plane going down was another issue of someone might have sabotaged equipment. But Truman says he was on the verge of getting something done when they killed him. And then he says this in his quote, "Notice how I said they killed him." And nobody asked a question about that. He denounced the OSS. He denounced the CIA. He says this is not what it was when I created it. It's long overreached its capabilities of what I initially intended it to be. Allen Dulles rang him in for that and made him try to print a retraction saying that he forgot all that, or that he should take all that back. And Truman didn't want to do it, but I think they eventually wrote an article about it, and that was published. But these people, these presidents, through the paranoia to the end, they kind of eventually allude to some things where it's like, why didn't you say that when you were there? And it's like none of these guys probably felt they had the power to actually do that. It's kind of like your Nixon thing that you mentioned.
I think it's very powerful, that scene from Nixon. Everybody should watch at least that scene, if not the whole movie. The stuff with the CIA is pretty good too, where he's dealing with the CIA director, William Colby, who's a very scary figure. William Colby is very scary.
Oh man, I
Yeah,
talked to his friend on here,
really.
James something. See, I think Colby, I watched him through the church committee, and I've seen the documents where they said they're going to have 2 people, and if you watch some of the like the heart attack gun on YouTube clip, you can watch the video of them showing a heart attack gun. Those 2 people behind Colby to his left and to his right were there to stop him from divulging too much information. Now, it is bad what the CIA was doing, but he thought the best way to get on a good ground is to give them some of the information, give them some things, let them feel like they can trust us, because they should. We are the CIA. That was his viewpoint in those church committee things. You can see he's sweating his ass off. And then it's like, what, a few years later, he's found dead.
In the
And
Potomac. Yeah.
yeah, he went apparently kayaking in the middle of the night after getting off of the phone with his wife at 10 o'clock while he was having dinner, left his house unlocked, which is what his friend said was suspicious. A guy
Exactly.
lives in CIA for 30 something years and you leave your doors unlocked.
Yeah.
And he just went kayaking in the middle of the night and found dead. So
Yeah.
Jefferson Morley, I've spoke to him about it, and he's a very non-conspiracy person, or doesn't even want to entertain that killing of discussion. But he said that he does, after the Kennedy stuff he's looked into, raise that up on there might have been foul play involved. And again,
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. And I think, a lot of these people who've done, you can't get to that level without having your hands dirty. I'll just keep coming back to that. But that doesn't mean that at the end of their lives that they're not seeking redemption. And it could be the case with Colby that he was seeking redemption. And at that point, that those who want to guard the secrets, the secret keepers, they, as we call them, had to silence him before he went too far. It could very much be something like that. I mean, I think that's what got Martin Luther King killed. That's what got RFK killed. That's what got JFK killed. I mean, the they and I know you know this because I think we talked about it last time. The what Mrs. Kennedy said after the assassination. She didn't say much, but one thing she said was she still was wearing the blood-stained dress, uh, Coco Chanel outfit or whatever she was wearing. Said, "Look what they did to Jack. Look what they did to Jack." What did she mean by that? Look what they did. So there again, they. Is this the beast? Is this this amorphous force that these people that represent it, that work for it, that maybe can't stop it, but are part of it? And that could be CIA people, government people, corporate people, whoever, foreign entities, who knows, uh, a consortium. And like I said, you can quickly get into the weeds with conspiracies, but they keep using the word they, and it's I don't think it's just coincidence, you know. And it's something that worries me a great deal as I get later in my career. And this is something I talked about, and it kind of goes into the paranormal, but I don't want to divert too much from what the purpose of this is. But um, they do converge because there are things going on in UAP, research and all that that intersect with international politics, foreign policy, the very power corridors of Washington and around the world. And a lot of it has to do with the, keeping the big secret, you know, not only UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena or whatever, but also the idea of psi or psionics, as they call it now, which is an old Soviet translated term, I think. Uh, this idea of telepathy and telekinesis and all that stuff. Uh, but and we know that they still use remote viewers. They did. That's clear. Stargate and all that. They still use them today. And I'm here to tell you, and I didn't sign an NDA, and I'm free to speak until they silence me. But I have helped some government agencies with my remote viewing. I did it privately. I'm not on a payroll. I didn't sign an NDA. I'm not part of the government. All I did was I have a friend of mine, I'm not going to mention any names, but a friend of mine works for one of the agencies. He needed some help finding a Iranian general who went missing for a while. And he said, I know you have, you can channel in these things. Can you help us find out where he is and his condition? And I said, sure, I'll try. And I got a very clear signal where he was, what his condition was. I told him, and he said, thank you. Yeah. And then like a week later, it came out in the news that he was still alive. He was in a hospital, whatever. And I had seen all that stuff. So, and then I said, well, I can help more if you want me to. I want to help, and next thing you know, I get a phone call. I'm not going to say the name of the person. It's probably a false name anyway. And they said, "Yeah, we heard that you have some information on," and I'll tell you what it's about because they're all home now. It was about the American hostages in Gaza, the last three that were alive that are now out now, the American Israeli hostages, right? And I said, "Yeah, I'll help." And they said, "Well, meet me at a coffee shop." And I said, "Well, I don't think the information I'm going to give would be something you want a bunch of people to hear in this coffee shop. So how about we meet in a secure location, meaning a skiff, right? And, secure compartmentalized information facility."
I learned those from the UAP hearings. I got that one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just thought maybe, I know you knew, but maybe some of your listeners
They
might
say it
not
like
know.
20 times. Like, we'll have to take that into a skiff. I'm like, oh my God, somebody say something.
Yeah, I know, I know. And then, so they said, can you meet at this time and meet us here? And then we'll go to a secure facility. Ended up being a FBI field office. Went inside. And there were two people there interviewing me. One of them showed me their FBI credentials. The other one, I looked at at them, and the FBI person said they don't show their they don't ever show their credentials. So then I knew who it was. It was a CIA person, right? Because they never show anything. And so then they interviewed me for about an hour and a half. I gave them all the information. I had grid coordinates. I had condition. I had a telepathic connection with one of them. And about 2 weeks later, the first one was released. I know it sounds like I'm BSing, telling a BS story, but 2 weeks later, the older gentleman was released. Now I forgot his name, but Keith Siegel was released. And then recently, the last one was released, Eden Alexander, and before that, Sagi Dekelchen was released. Those are all the ones that I had information on. And I don't know if I played any part to help, but the bottom line here is that they're still using assets. Now, you would think that they would, all I said when we were done, I said, I hope this is of help and I hope you guys don't think I'm nuts or whatever. I just wanted to help. I felt like I wanted to help. They, oh, no, no, that's fine. I said, you don't have to tell me anything other than just let me know, like send me a thumbs up or something that everything worked out. I never got any response. I tried to contact that person. That line of communication's dead now. It's gone. So they just disappeared. And, uh, my wife said after the first guy was released 2 weeks later, she said, did you have something to do with this? And I said, I have no idea if I did or not. Maybe I did. Maybe, like intelligence gathering, it's always not just one thing. It's like many different things, probably 100 different sources of information to find out how to negotiate or how to find somebody or put pressure on them to give them up or whatever. So I like to feel I had some positive thing. But the bottom line is that this stuff is going on all the time and at a much deeper level. I know people who are at a much deeper level doing this kind of stuff. So it all coincides, and it has to do with power. It has to do with continuing war. You know, it has to do with control versus free will. It really comes down to that: control versus free will. And the ultimate power that our government has over us resides in its war powers. So that's how all this intersects. Uh, the ultimate power our government has over us, you and I, and everybody else in the United States or any country, is its war powers. Because when they go to war, they can suspend habeas corpus, which they're talking about. They can institute the draft against your will. There's a lot of things they can do. They can curtail civil rights, even the First Amendment rights. We've seen that with speech, freedom of speech. So all of that has been done and has been done, even in our democracy. So you have to. They keep feeding the beast, to put it back into Oliver Stone's terms. They keep feeding the beast, and we're all subjected to it. And anyway, so it's going on all the time. I want to help, but I don't want to help do bad things. I want to help, like rescuing people who are hostages. That's important. They're caught up in the middle of this thing, whether they were Israeli soldiers on an outpost or whatever. They're just cogs in the machine. They're just pawns on the playing board, as on the chessboard, which is what my brother always said. He was just a pawn on a chessboard in Vietnam. That's how he felt. And he's right. And all of us are. We're pawns on a chessboard, and we're fighting to have our freedom of choice. We're fighting for our free will, and we have to keep fighting for it. Otherwise, we'll be totally under control. So I didn't mean to be so dramatic, but
No, I couldn't agree more with you.
I'm trying to match everything up. And what you're doing and other people like you who are honestly going very hard at these, even if it's in the past, you know, uh, it illuminates what's going on right now too. And that's really important because so many people have historical amnesia. They just, oh, this is totally brand new. Well, not really. This has happened before. This is how it happened. So re-examining that is very important. What you're doing, what we're doing today, talking about Vietnam and the power and the war.
George Reedy said something in the same interview I mentioned about the whole sending more people in because they can't die in vain. The guy interview asked him, "Do you think people will ever forget the Vietnam War?" And he says, "Yes, people will forget the Vietnam War because self-preservation. People don't want to look at the bad of what they've done. They just want to move on and go on to the next thing." And it's very like kind of revealing because I mean, obviously towards the end of his time, he wasn't a good guy. He's very close to LBJ, and if you don't like LBJ, you're just not going to like him. But towards the end, he got fed up with LBJ. He got fed up with everything because he was just tired of politics, and he found a good hard exit strategy when LBJ stopped running. So I appreciate what you've been able to do for coming on the show and sharing your experience and your perspective on the Vietnam and having this kind of conversation with me about it and kind of covering all these areas that we've covered. Is there a place where people can find your links? I'm going to recommend people look at your past episodes as well too, but I would like you to be able to say, your social media handles, your website, anything that you have available.
Yeah, well, all of my stuff is on all my published, even my historical political science books are all on Amazon. So you can find it there, but you can also find everything that I've done, music, theater, books, the paranormal stuff. It's all on my full name, bruceolavsolheim.com, and you can find everything there. But all my published books are on Amazon. So, and one thing I wanted to say about George Reedy, I like George Reedy. He's the one who introduced me, and my former professor Gary Hess, the concept of the investment trap. And that's exactly what, investment of lives, investment of money. The more lives, the more money you invest, the harder it is to divest, the harder it is to say, let's pull the plug, let's get out. Because people say, why didn't they pull the plug? Why didn't they get out? Well, we'd been heavily investing since 1950 in Vietnam. So it was very difficult to stop that investment. And the other thing I learned in relation to that is that the flag always follows the dollar. Wherever we're investing, if something goes wrong, the flag, being the military, is going to go in and protect that investment. And it's always true. It seems to always be true. The flag follows the dollar, and we can get involved in an investment trap. And anyway, I enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you didn't mind my little divergent thing there, but I think it's important for people to know that this stuff is real. It's being used by those in power. Um, and we have to be very careful to preserve our free will because it's a battle for our soul, really our soul. And you don't have to think of that in a religious sense, but who we are, our free will is who we are as individuals. None of us want to live an other directed, controlled life. We want to be free. We want to be free. That's what it's all about. And what you're doing, and I hope what I'm doing, is trying to, you know, keep us that way. So,
I think it's important to talk about it. A lot of people don't want to have conversations like this. They just want to go on about their day. But I think it's important, especially from a historical standpoint, to address some of these factors. And I always enjoy talking with you. Every conversation we've had has been a good one so far. Hope to have plenty more with you. I have to ask you more about Stargate next time. But I'm going to link all your links in the description below for people to be able to check out and follow and see your work as well too. And thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank, and stay tuned for our next episode.